Genuine conversations with unique minds on the threats, the complexity, and the geopolitics shaping our world. This is the Entropy Podcast with Francis Gorman.
Hi everyone, welcome to the Entropy Podcast. I'm your host Francis Gorman. Before we dive in, if today's conversation challenges you, sparks a new idea, or sharpens how you think about the world, don't keep it to yourself. Subscribe, leave a review, and share this episode with someone who enjoys staying curious. Today I'm joined by Aidan McCullen, host of the Innovation Show and the author of Undisruptible. He's one of the most thoughtful voices across the technology sector on reinvention, innovation, and human change. Aidan has gone from elite professional sport to interviewing some of the world's leading thinkers. He helps leaders and organizations understand how to adapt before they're forced to. Today we'll get into what real reinvention takes, why so many people and companies resist change, and what he's learned from hundreds of conversations with brilliant minds. Aidan, it's lovely to have you here with me today.
Great to be with you, Francis. Looking forward to our chat.
Yeah, so am I, Aidan. And you know, as I've been looking into your background and listening to the Innovation Show, you've had some really clever people on. But I have to ask, you come from the rugby background. When that career ended, was that the inflection point where you said, what do I do now? How did this path start from professional sports into what you're doing today in the reinvention, innovation space and through your consultancy?
So I've had to reframe this one, Francis, but I got injured quite a lot in my career, and I got injured right at the very pinnacle of my career. So right at the very top, playing for Toulouse, arguably the best club in the world, certainly the best club in Europe. And I was playing for that team. Didn't expect to get into the side, which is probably not a great thing, but I got in the side, was the starting number 8 for many, many games, then hurt my knee. And after that, I had an operation and I went to a much lesser club, which was a club in London, London Irish. And when I was there, I was struggled with injury so much. Whenever I did get back from injury, I was fighting for my place. And it was then I started to read. And one of the interesting things was I used to go to a disrupted business, which was Borders. You remember the old bookshop? And there was one in Kingston, which was over the road from where I lived. And I used to go there. There was a Starbucks inside it, sit down and pick up books. And I picked up one day a magazine, and it was on the cover, it was about Nokia. It was a Forbes magazine, 2007. And the article read, 500 million customers, can anyone catch the cell phone king, something like that. And I remember going, oh, this is a really interesting company, I'm going to start following them. And then a few months later, their stock was on the floor, and I was like, oh, what the heck happened there? So I got interested, and I just started following businesses, understanding what was coming down the line, understanding where businesses was growing. So I really got into it then and dedicated any spare time I had to preparing for the future, the inevitable end of a career.
And that's super interesting. I love the bookshop angle, because I think most of my great ideas came from someone else. You know, when I pick up a book and read it, I often say that the podcast was born out of reading Never Eat Alone by Keith Ferrazzi. I'm not sure if you've ever read that book by Keith, but it's an amazing kind of guide to your network is directly linked to your net worth, is kind of the premise of it. And, you know, building that social muscle is really important. So, you know, that's kind of, I thought about the podcast. You obviously have the Innovation Show, and I was reading Bill Gates is one of your advocates. How did that come about?
Well, he just shared actually one of the episodes on LinkedIn, and I was like going, that must be a mistake. So a few years ago, that was now about 7 years ago. Interestingly, I sat beside Keith Ferrazzi at an event not so long ago, and he dropped me a line afterwards to ask to come onto the show. And I hadn't read the book, but I was familiar with that line, "Never Dine Alone." And I as you said there, the biggest thing you said in the introduction, how I'm fascinated about how people leave it until it's too late to do something about the future. In rugby, for example, where I was, many people wait till the end to start preparing. And that's why I was saying I was lucky, because I got this kind of glimpse of the future before the end was upon me, which is the biggest opportunity, because when you're in a moment of crisis, you're not going to think straight. And to your point about the network, if you don't do the work on your network when it's not important, you don't have a network when it is important. And for me, that's the pattern. Everything. It's a pattern in health. It's the pattern in fitness. It's the pattern in your relationships, that if you leave it too late, it's almost too hard to repair it. And there's a Spartan warrior mantra that I live by, which is the more you sweat in times of peace, the less you bleed in war. So you do the work before it's necessary to do the work, and it's absolutely always the best time to do it.
And that's super interesting, Aidan. I also love the acronyms and the different phraseology from old Greek mythology that you can bring through. I have to ask, like, what's the difference? And I see this a lot from reinventing yourself versus kind of running away from the version you no longer like in the mirror. You know, the I want to be someone different, but I'm not really committed to it. So I'll make some, let's call them facial change, grow a beard, or, you know, I'll pretend I'm doing something else, but not really committed to. What do you see takes real kind of gusto to actually reinvent yourself, to really commit to get to be that person you want to be, rather than that imagery that you've perceived of who you should be?
So there was a really interesting book I read. We could talk all day about books that we've read, Francis, but there's a book called Psycho-Cybergenics by a guy called Maxwell Maltz. And Maltz was this guy who was, he basically did like facial surgery and nose transplant, nose restructuring and all this kind of stuff. And what he noticed was that he'd do work on a patient and they'd be back again looking for more work to be done in the future. And he just always saw that there was an underlying want in them for some type of bigger change. And that was one of the books I read in that period of my own transition. And the big thing I took from it was that you have to start with the way I think about it, you have to start with a to-be list before you start with a to-do list. So what do I want to be? How do I want to show up? Like, what do I want people to say about me when I'm not in the room? That kind of way of thinking about things. And I work with a lot of heads of innovation, in particular, coaching them. And this is something I always say when it comes to their personal change, is you have to have some type of fuzzy vision. Even it doesn't have to be a clear vision, but some type of feeling about what you want to be before you start to go and start to do small minor work, like you said, like maybe get the haircut or shave the beard. So I think that's exactly the same that happens in innovation inside companies, is that they do the cosmetic work. They'll have the event, they'll bring in the keynote speaker, and it doesn't change a thing, because actually until you start to change real habits, you start to change how people are when they're at home, not just where they're at work, and you start to get inside their heads, you start to give them a vision for the future, nothing really changes. So it's really, that's why I'm so fascinated about how similar any kind of organizational change is to personal change, is to health change, anything in life, because it's just always the same dynamic. And if you can crack that dynamic and use it, for me, that was the transferable skill from sport, was that, one, I was disciplined. I wasn't the most talented player, but I'd always show up and outwork anybody. And that was the thing that I brought across into the working world then, and reflected now in the reading and the podcast and any kind of writing that I do. It's the same thing. And that's the hard thing inside businesses, because there's a famous story, and there was a book that was called Change or Die. And essentially, one of the big studies it pulled out was that people who had some type of heart transplant or a stent put in their heart, some type of really bad heart instance, that out of thousands of people they studied in the US, where a doctor sat them down and said, look, Aidan, you're going to have to change how you live or you're going to die. That out of those thousands of people, only 9% of people would make the changes to live. So on a personal level. And then we wonder why 75% plus of transformation efforts fail. Billions of dollars are wasted every year inside companies. And it's because you don't change what people do until you change how they think. Or the way I put it in the book is, you don't change business models until you change mental models. So that's the difficulty. And that's that's a hell of a lot of work. That's sustained work. It's not this big event. It's an ongoing habit that an organization needs to adopt.
No, when you said that, when you were talking before you used the example, I was thinking the very same thing. I saw a podcast recently, I think it was on Diary of a CEO, where a doctor was on talking about this very thing, and maybe the doctor made that reference, but he talked about the percentage of people that chose death, but he said they didn't mindfully choose death. They were hard coded to choose death. The habits that they'd built up over a lifetime, that their father did before them, that their grandfather did before him, this is who I am. I smoke 40 cigarettes a day and drink 10 pints and eat a hamburger, for dinner. This is who I am. So is there a part of reinvention and part of that mental model that you need to re-envisage? It's like the phoenix. Something has to burn down before you can rebirth. Does something have to break, even personally or within a company, before you can see that change?
I love that you asked that, actually, and I'm in the midst of a new book at the moment, and this is one of the things I talk about in the book, is that there's a term in the innovation literature called creative destruction, and creative destruction is exactly what you're saying, is that, say, for example, there's a recession, or now we have all the geopolitics, that many businesses will struggle with that, or a world you're very much involved in, technology and AI now rewriting the rules of business, essentially, and certainly with technology, that there'll be lots and lots of losers out of that, but there'll also be lots of new winners, and that's creative destruction. It was a term coined by Joseph Schumpeter, an economist, and he talked about this thing called Schumpeter's Gale, and this was the term behind it. But one of the ways I kind of think about it is that you can be the instigator of that. You can be the person who actually kind of goes, you know what, I'm going to do something about this. I'm going to I'm going to set the fire. I'm going to be like the phoenix. And to your point, the idea of the phoenix is every 500 years, this mythical creature willingly walks into the flames, burns itself up, and from what it used to be, gathers what's still useful. And that idea of being proactive about creative destruction, that you go, okay, let's go for a pint because I'm going off to the fire now. I always picture the phoenix down in the local bar, and the reluctant phoenix, and it's like, hey, Phoenix, it's time, the fire's right, it's going out there, man, you better go. And it's like, oh, no, just one more pint, one more for the road, and you got to do it. So there's obviously going to be reluctance about it, but you're better off ripping off the Band-Aid and just going for it. And in there, of course, it's going to be difficult. Like, I think that's the thing we have to acknowledge, is that you have to be cognizant that this is going to be difficult, because you're breaking apart familiarity, what you're used to. And this, both for individuals and organizations, the exact same thing. And what happens is you're basically resetting everything about the comfort that you have got used to. And the brain loves comfort, the comfort of the normal, the familiar. And that's the real difficulty. And there's a term that I talk about in the book called the S curve, but there's another curve called a J curve. And if you think about the letter J, and you remember when we had rulings on the page and you were learning to write, and the J would go below the line. So essentially the whole idea is it goes back before it goes forward. So you take up a new skill, or again, in your world, Francis, you're getting people to lean into new technologies, to adopt new technologies that everybody talks about. There's technological debt, so old systems. But there's also psychological debt, which is the old mental models that actually held people back. So they have to get used to the fact that, and be supported here as well, that of course you're going to be terrible at this thing at the start. You're learning a brand new skill, so you're going to go backwards before you can go forwards. We know that as an organization, we got your back. And I think, again, when anybody who's listened to us has gone through any kind of personal change, sometimes the very people who you think will support you are the very people who don't, and actually try and talk you out of it, and kind of going, hey, Phoenix, don't bother going to flames. Stay here with us, have a few more pints. And you're kind of, no, I kind of made my decision. No, don't do it. And I say this I lecture in Trinity College, Francis, and I say this to the students all the time, that you have to let go of that as well. And you have to be aware that if you go and make some type of personal reinvention strategy, that you're going to lose some friends, because you're going to become a different person. And sometimes the people who are most resistant to that are your friends, because they don't want you to change. And anybody who's traveled knows that. You go away, you experience a different culture, you come back and you feel a little bit more lonely because you've grown, and those people who have stayed around haven't grown as much. And organizations are no different, that you may go and learn a new skill. A lot of other people inside the organization may be jealous of that skill and actually hold it against you. And the status quo, by its very nature, is going to resist the change. People who are at the top of the organization today are there because of skills that they learned yesterday. And now comes the CTO and goes, hey, we're going to introduce a whole new ways of working, whole new set of technologies. And people are going to go, whoa. What does this mean to me? Does this mean that I still have my corner office? Does it still mean that I can still have my commute and drop my kids to school the way I do every morning? And it's all that messy middle that we call it in innovation, that when you're in between this phase transition between the old and the new, things fall apart. And in there, new relationships are formed, old ones are lost, and people struggle with that.
That's super interesting. I almost feel like there's a level of grief. You know, you have to experience loss before you can look at what's next. You know, you need to come to terms with that, whether personally or in business. Is that what you would see, Aidan, when you come in to companies? Because I talk to a lot of kind of business owners that still are in control of their company, and you know, they'll often say their biggest weakness is to reinvent what works, because it's always worked. You know, this is how I made my first 100,000, my first million, my first whatever, you know, so why would I change? But the world has now changed, and AI is drastically undermining sectors. It's, you know, in some cases allowing people to be drastically more capable, and others it's making them drastically less capable, depending on how they're using it. So like, is there this element of grief that has to play a larger piece in innovation and reinvention, when you kind of understand, well, I've lost what it was? I think Nokia example at the start is probably a good one from the corporate sense. You know, they never thought the smartphone would take off. They didn't move with the times. They were too committed to what has always worked, because that's what will work. But you know, it didn't. There was a line there that once it crossed over, the exponential drop in value was rapid.
So this is a huge thing, Francis, the grief element. That Peter Drucker, the famous management guru, he said that if you're going to do something new, you're going to have to stop doing something old. And that's really difficult for people, because usually they're measured on the old. And if you think about in your own organization, or maybe you're a leader of an organization listening to us, that you're trying to bring in some new model that in a way competes or undermines the old model in some way, that of course people are they're not only going to resist it, but they're actually going to sabotage it. And they're going to sabotage it sometimes it's not in dynamic ways where it's very visible, but they can sabotage it by doing nothing. That's how they can sabotage it. Or one way people sabotage it a lot is like they're too busy, and they're too busy doing the thing that got them to where they are today. So nobody puts any energy into the new thing. It's a process in innovation that we call resource allocation process, the RAP model. It's a guy called Joseph Bauer, who was Clayton Christensen, the famous innovation guru, his dissertation advisor and professor in college. And by giving no resource to something, you starve it of resource and it just dies, like anything in life. So that's a huge thing. Now, to your other point, a way I'll kind of introduce this is another metaphor that I use in the book, this idea of the great metamorphosis of the caterpillar into the butterfly. So it goes through a certain amount of stages. And when I was doing keynotes first, when I started doing this, I used to have an artist. Now, none of us need an artist to that level anymore. I used to pay a lot of money to get these beautiful slides created. Like my slide decks she did a magnificent job. And she goes to me, I wanted 4 slides to kind of map this transition. And she goes, Aidan, there's actually 5 stages. And I was like, she's just looking for more work here. So she wasn't. She was actually bang on point. And it was the penultimate stage, so the second last stage, that was so remarkable and spoke to me so much. So I'll very quickly tell you this transition. So, and think here about how an organization or an individual goes change. So that idea of the cycle of the phoenix, that you take out of what the last iteration was, what's still useful in order to fuel what's going to become in the future. So the very first act when the caterpillar emerges from its shell is it eats it, it uses it as fuel that's going to fuel its future. And then it goes into this stage that we call in innovation incremental growth. So basically a bigger version of what it used to be. In the caterpillar's life, what it does is it consumes multiple times its own body weight and leaves, sheds its outer skin, gets bigger and bigger. The same thing, just a little bit bigger. And organizations get stuck in that cycle. And organizations experience exactly what the caterpillar does, because next, these cells deep within the DNA of the caterpillar, beautifully called imaginal discs, named after the word imagination, they come online at a certain period in the life cycle, and they influence the caterpillar to become the chrysalis. And the chrysalis, as opposed to the cocoon, the chrysalis is a life cycle stage. And we know here what happens with the cocoon. But let me tell you what happens just before then. And anybody who's a change agent inside an organization knows this implicitly. So what happens is these cells are so different from that of the organism that the immune system sees them as foreign and quashes them. So just like the corporate immune system does to the change agent, the same thing happens in nature, in one of the simplest organisms we have. And in time, enough of these imaginal discs pile together, they come together, they accumulate, and they overpower the caterpillar to become the chrysalis. And inside the chrysalis, an enzyme is released, just like stomach acid to melt down food, melts down the caterpillar into this soupy, loopy fuel that once again is going to fuel its future. So that's the messy middle. But here's the second stage, second last stage. When the butterfly emerges from the cocoon, which, by the way, is the hardened outer skin of what was the caterpillar, change is difficult, it clings to the cocoon. And when I saw that, this was the stage she was telling me, because I thought the last stage would be the butterfly just flies off. And maybe I was being a cheapskate, Francis, and trying to save myself a €500 slide. But when I saw it, I was like going, oh my God, it totally needs this. Because what happens is the butterfly clings to that cocoon. And what's happening is its wings are filling up with fluid before it takes flight. But when I saw it, I thought about exactly what happened. Just as I still see today, many, many sports people I used to play with, they cling to the identity. That's what I saw. I was like clinging to the past. And the only way they can enjoy that future is by letting go of that past. And that's the final stage where you see the butterfly flying off. Now, to your point about businesses, that's exactly what you see when you have transformation inside an organization. When I work with organizations, I'm sitting with the leadership team, the board sometimes, and we have these tough conversations, and we have this realization that it's time for a bigger change. There's a moment of sadness. And actually, what you actually see is just silence. You see a few, oh, okay. And then you see some people leaving, going and getting a coffee, maybe going and smoking a cigarette or something they haven't smoked in 20 years. And it's a moment of total realization that, oh, this is real. This is big. This is going to be difficult. Because what it ultimately means is not everybody's going to make it in the organization. And that's what happens at the heart of many, many of these disruptions that we see, the poster children of disruption, like Kodak, for example. Kodak could not bring themselves to let go of so many of their colleagues who would not make it in the transition. Nokia is a bit deeper. Because you mentioned it, I'll share it. I did a really, really deep dive. And I mean, I don't think anybody's gone as deep on Nokia. And maybe I have history at Nokia going back to 2007. But a load of papers came out, Francis, recently that share the real stories about Nokia. And one of the people I got on the show, apart from those authors of those papers, was a guy, Timo Partanen, who was the chief information officer. He was head of insights for Nokia. He was the guy who presented a paper about the iPhone, the threat of the iPhone. And I interviewed about him. I got my hands on that paper. It was available online. I stumbled upon it. I just reached out. I saw this name on it. I was like, I've seen that guy online. Reached out to him. He agreed to come on the show. Absolutely fascinating. Some of the stuff he told me, and again, I'm sure you've seen this, Francis. I'm sure many of your audience have seen this, especially if they're CTOs, because you're at such the coal face of change today, especially. But he was saying he was presenting this. So they knew about the smartphone threat, by the way. They totally knew about it. Their spec document is absolutely on point. They had seen for years that Apple were hiring people, that it was clear they were going to release a phone. They also knew that a smartphone was a threat to them, but they thought they were on top of it. And when this guy told me the story, he said, my biggest failure, he said, was I presented this to them and I told them, and they were like going, yeah, no, this is a huge threat. We're all over it. And he listened to them. He said, my mistake was I believed that they were doing something about it. He said, that was the difference. The other thing was, imagine the R&D team were not allowed to use an Apple product. There was no Apple products allowed in the building. You actually got given out to. It was career threatening to have a foreign device inside the company. So they had no feel for it. They didn't know how good it was. They thought they were a better phone, and they were a better phone, but the form factor had changed. And this was a computer in your pocket that just happened to be able to make calls. It was that caught them. And also the fact that they had mortgages on factories in China that only had the capability to build dumb phones. There was many, many factors. People were afraid of telling the truth. People were afraid of sharing how bad their own technology was. And something you'll understand, their platform, Migo and Symbian, which is essentially their OSs, that like the OS that you see inside the iPhone or Android in the Android phones, was terrible. But they thought it was good enough. And it was all these things combined. The fear of talking to the board, the fear of losing your career, the fear of losing the identity of the company because it was basically the heart of Finland. All these things coming together led to the decline. And it was a failure to let go of the past. It was a failure to speak truth to power.
You know, when I knew you were coming on the show, in the first episode I listened to was that Nokia episode, and it was absolutely fascinating. So I'd recommend anyone listening, if you want to go check that one out, head over to the Innovation Show. It's definitely worth a listen. The insights there are powerful, to say the least, and it really does paint a different perspective of the insider looking out versus, you know, the reality of what was happening around, which is great. Your Caterpillar analogy also, my 5-year-old is currently learning about Caterpillar, so his bedtime stories night's going to be very intense. I'm going to give him the full breakdown of all of the different stages. Aidan, I have to ask, is curiosity natural or does it have to be trained? Because when I look at innovation and reinvention, I think curiosity has to be a key part of it. What have you observed or learned over the years talking to all of these brilliant individuals in this space?
Curiosity is the power, I think, behind innovation, and it's very hard to say it could be trained. It's like anybody who has kids, you'll have one kid more curious than the other, and certainly I was going to call the show the innovation show. I was going to call it the curiosity show at the start, because actually I was just interested in everything. Like, I'd get interested by a story, I'd go looking to interview that person, books about everything, about health, about nature, about science, and I was going all over the shop. And actually just eventually I got to a point where I got into the groove of innovation, and the thing is, once you discover how much they're in a theme or a topic, you go deep, and you yourself get better. And all the conversations you've had before, I'm sure you've had this already, they compound, and you start to draw upon something somebody else said. And it's such a gift. I have to say, I find my own show an absolute privilege to talk to people and learn from them regularly, and just hear how I may know what they're talking about, but it's the way they present it, slightly different. You start to see a different angle from it. But I do think like, you know, the whole idea is that you can't force a horse to water. I actually have an upgrade on that, saying you can't waterboard a horse. So, you know, that idea of waterboarding, where it's like you stick the head and you're like doing a questioning, stick the head in the water in a bucket. But I do find that if you have people forced to innovate, they actually can't. Like some people are just very good at execution, and some people are very good at admin. Innovators are not usually good at admin. They really struggle with stuff like, oh, give me a plan for that idea. They struggle with that stuff. And I don't think everybody has the full gamut of skills. So you have to lean into where people are really good. And it's really important when you're putting a team together for transformation, that they want to be part of that team, that they have some skill to bring to that they're not just there for what they think is beanbags and post-it notes, but they're there for the real journey that it is. And it's a political journey. Like, being an innovator is not what it looks like. It's a lot of political talking to people and getting them on board, trying to find the cynics, turn the cynics around, trying to anticipate where the block's going to come from. And one of the most difficult things, I think, is actually giving the credit away. And you really need support from on high. You need air cover, we call it in innovation, because you're going to end up giving wins away. And the less they look like they had anything to do with you, the more likely they are to stick. And it's a real difficulty. And people who work in innovation know that. And that's why they need air cover. And they need people to understand that it's them cajoling and pulling strings behind and planting little seeds of ideas here and there. Like, it's that whole idea that the best way to sell an idea is make it someone else's and actually do all the work as well. So, to your point, curiosity is what gets you there, what gets you onto the pitch. And then tenacity and resilience is actually what gets you over the line.
You know, it's fascinating. I see that the whole time. When it's your idea, it gets torn apart. But then, if someone comes back to the next meeting and goes, "I had an idea," it's the same thing in a different guise. It seems to land. Which is always humorous to look and a win-win situation normally if it's the outcome you were fighting for. And I have to ask, because obviously I host this show and I've got to talk to lots of people, and I totally agree with you. It's an absolute privilege, and that knowledge that you kind of obtain naturally through these conversations is fascinating, and it opens so many different paths in your mind to, things you would have never considered or never have measured properly before. You've had a lot of conversations with a lot of very smart people across multiple industries. Is there any conversations that you've had that have just stuck with you or have completely changed your outlook?
Oh man, so many. I think the huge benefit I had. So I don't know if you noticed, but I worked as head of innovation for RTE, the national broadcaster, for 8 months. I only lasted 8 months. I knew I shouldn't be there after 8 minutes, by the way. But the biggest gift I had was actually the show, starting the show. And I just learned so much from having those experiences of huge resistance to change, and actually then doing the show and learning to put a language on what I was experiencing. And I think that's the thing. Like the biggest thing I found was you don't often have a language to be able to express what you want the organization to do. You don't have these mental models, and they're just like lenses for anybody who wears glasses, just like a set of lenses. So you kind of go, oh, I see what's happening here. And when you don't have them, you don't know what you're doing. You're drowning a lot of the time. And you often feel it's you, that you've failed in some way. But when you see that these are patterns that repeat time and time again, there's a quote attributed to Mark Twain: "History doesn't repeat, but it rhymes." And the more I do the show, the more I see those rhymes appear. And the biggest thing I did was actually start to write loosely associated to each show every week. So I've never missed a writing or a week. In 650 weeks, I'm doing the show now. So episode 650 drops today. And it's writing about it helps me first consolidate it to memory, but secondly, make sense of it and make it mine, make it stick to something that has happened to me or some pattern that I've seen. And I've done so many, like in the early days, so many random ones that just sort of kind of gone, what? Like I did one on DMT, which is the active ingredient of ayahuasca. I did one of those early. And actually, the guy had rarely been interviewed, which is why I was so surprised. But I think one of the best, and just because the guy was so damn amusing, is a guy called Robert Sapolsky. And Robert Sapolsky was a primatologist. He's multi-disciplined and multi-decorated, but he wrote a book called Behave, and it was about human behavior. And he drew on his experience of baboons, basically working with monkeys, living out in the Serengeti or somewhere in Africa, living with this tribe of animals, of baboons. And just what he saw and how he described it and how he brought it back then and mapped it to studies of humans. And you can just see all of humanity there, bullying even. Like, so one of the dynamics he talked about was if you see somebody who is, so an alpha male hits a beta male, so somebody who's lower than them in the hierarchy, the first thing that beta male is going to go out and look for one below. So it takes out the anger on somebody else. You go, well, that happens all the time. It happens in business all the time. And it could be somebody who, has a domineering partner at home and they're a nightmare in work because it's the way they actually take out that anger. They literally take it out in other people. But out of all the stories he shared, one of the fascinating ones was, and I always quote this, and I had never seen it quoted before. He talked about the origin of type A personality. So these people who are, have to be the first person into the dentist because they can't be late. They reverse into car parking spots because they don't want to waste any time coming out in the morning. So just really hyper efficient type A personalities. And what had happened was the two guys who discovered this, they had a waiting room in their cabin, in their office. And as people were waiting, they'd seen that the chairs had just been worn down by people's nails. And they just thought that this was normal wear and tear. But an upholsterer came in one day, and the upholsterer kind of goes, what the hell are you guys doing to your patients? He goes, this is not normal wear and tear. And then they started to notice that he turned on this lens for them, that it was the type A's coming in the morning. And they were so anxious about being late or delayed in any sense. They were just ripping these chairs to shreds. And what Sapolsky said, he said, if you want to know if the elephant in the zoo has a stomach ache, don't ask the vet, ask the cage cleaner. And I was like, that's exactly the analogy for customer changes. That's exactly the analogy for organizational changes, because it's people who are in the field. It's people who are at the edges. If, say, for example, you're in a bank, it's the people who are out dealing with customers, actually out of the building, out dealing with customers, who have the most important information, but often no way to share it back to the organization. And there's a term that we use in innovation literature. It's like, it was Andy Grove, who's the former CEO of Intel. He said that snow always melts from the edges, because that's where the changes first start to happen. And then they come more and more towards the center. And that's exactly what happens in organizational change. Yet, those people don't have often a way to share that information, or the people in the center don't want to hear it. And that's often the case as well, which is a huge tragedy when it comes to change.
I love that. I love the analogy again. I've got so many great analogies from this conversation. I'm going to be mulling them over all evening. I have to have 650 episodes. Like, that is serious dedication. At what point did you know the innovation show was going to sustain? Because I know myself, you start off with maybe 3, 5, 10, then you hit 50 downloads, and then you get to 100 or whatever, and you're starting to see traction, but you don't quite know. But you keep showing up because you have to show up, because you don't want to be the one who goes, I told you that wasn't going to work out, Francis. Or what point did you kind of feel that, actually I have something here? This is, people are relating to this show. They're coming back. My numbers are growing slow. And I think one thing that always struck me with podcasts is you don't get that instant hit of satisfaction of 50,000 downloads. It's downloads start off kind of low and slow, but you see them repeat and you see them kind of grow at a rate that's not exponential in most cases, but consistent.
Yeah. So I always tell people who are doing podcasts, don't ever look at the numbers at this for like, I don't think I looked at them for well over a year. And I'll tell you the origin of the show, because I was kind of getting at it. I was in RTE and they had asked me to come up with an idea. My boss had asked me to come up with an idea for a show that it would appeal to non-Irish natives. So living in Ireland, who had maybe been here to work in Google or LinkedIn or Facebook or one of these kind of companies. So I had the idea, the innovation show, and I had nothing to do with it. I was purely a piece of paper. And I was like going, I actually think this would work. There's a lot of change in technology. I was talking about stuff back then, like IoT. This is 2016. IoT, AI, augmented reality, stuff like that. So that was the concept. They said, oh no, that'll never work. And I knew a guy down in the radio department. It's supposed to be a TV show, by the way, originally. And I knew a guy down in the radio department. And I'm dogged, man. And I went down to him and I was like, and I just wanted to make sure I wasn't nuts. I was like, hey, he's the head of 2FM, a guy called Dan Healy, brilliant guy. I said, Dan, he's from down your neck of the woods, I think. He's a Kildare man anyway. And I said, Dan, help me out here, man. Is this crazy idea? And he goes, no, he glances at the page. He's like, brilliant idea. He goes, I tell you what, we need more talk content. And this was like 2016. So there wasn't as many podcasts or talk shows, and radio shows are expensive, because it's not just playing music. You have to have guests and pay for guests and pundits and all that kind of stuff. So anyway, he says, this is a great idea. And he goes, what budget do you have? And I said, no budget. I said, like, it's nothing to do with me. And he goes, well, and by the way, then I used to do rugby commentary. And he goes, you still do your rugby commentary, don't you? And I said, yeah. And he goes, well, this is just the same thing. That's just rugby crap, and this is just different crap. And I was like, all right. And he goes, I'll tell you what, I'll give you a loan of a producer. This guy, Alan Swan. Alan helped me get up and running in 6 weeks. And then he was like my training wheels and got me started. So ultimately it came to this, Francis, where my boss was like, stop the show or we're going to get rid of you. And the funny thing was, I just passed my 6-month performance review. It was glowing. Like I couldn't have got a better review. And this is like a few weeks later. And I hadn't told them, you see, I'd started a show. And the show went pretty quickly to the top of the tech charts back then. I don't think it was that hard because there was so few podcasts. But I got an ultimatum. And I was like, stop the show, stop your writing. I got that as well. And I obviously said no. And when I had that decision, it was a tough decision. It was like the caterpillar. It was like the butterfly clinging onto the cocoon. I had to deal with leaving the company. It was, I wasn't happy anyway, because I didn't feel like I did anything meaningful. And I felt the writing was meaningful and the show was meaningful. It was the way I actually found some type of purpose. So I managed to then bring that. I killed off, it was called the RTE Innovation Show, killed it off, started the Innovation Show. Amazing things started to happen. My first guest was Seth Godin, the famous marketing guru, brilliant thinker. He got behind the show. Because he got behind the show, I got other big speakers, bigger thinkers, and then just did what you did. And I started to focus on books, because I found that authors had a great way to articulate what they were thinking, and they were great storytellers, as long as they didn't have a ghostwriter. And the show just started to grow and grow and grow. And then the next kind of inflection point was COVID. And during COVID, I was working for a different organization. I work for myself now and run my own company, but I was working for an organization. I got let go with 3 weeks notice, and I had time on my hands. So I started to do video. I was only doing audio to that point. started to do video. And then again, like the universe delivered, I started to get opportunities to do talks. I got my book deal to start to do my book. I had bought all the equipment, and when COVID hit, they were looking for speakers who could deliver high quality content over video. I started to get asked to do video content, and it just went on. And then ultimately last November, at the time I was sitting beside Keith Ferrazzi, I was at this thing called the Thinkers 50. And the Thinkers 50 is like the Oscars for management thinkers and books. And I was an author, and I was invited to come along. Didn't have any concept that I was going to win. And it was the first time ever a podcast has won. So I won the Global Award for Innovation. And I have to say, it's exactly like my rugby career. Wasn't the most talented guy, but like I just kept showing up, kept going to the gym, and eventually they had to pick me. And I think that was a similar dynamic that happened with the Innovation Show.
Incredible, Aidan. And look, it's an absolute credit where credit's due there. You know, you endured, and you know, it's paid off. Look, I know we're up on time, so it was a real pleasure having you on, and thanks a million for sitting down to talk with me today.
Absolute pleasure. I wish you the best of luck. I look forward to seeing episode 650, man. No pressure.
only 540 something episodes to go, but we'll get to it.
Well, you know what? My son asked me, he goes, how many of the Innovation Show are you going to do? And I was like, I was kind of trying to calculate my age. And I was like, I've got another 1,300 in me, maybe.
That's incredible. We'll bring you back on show number 3000 then to see how much you've learned from there. But look, it was an absolute pleasure. Thank you very much.
Cheers, man.